Hello, guys. Good morning. I hope more than just me is in front of their screen. We're going to wait a couple of minutes, 1 minute actually, before we start. So we give an opportunity to other people to connect. According to what I see here, there are 7 people now watching, 9 people now watching. So that's good. At any rate, if you are unable to connect right now, or if you want to or you cannot finish watching the lecture, or you want to review it later, it will be saved on my YouTube channel. So there you go. Okay, let's get started. First of all, this is the very first time that I do this type of exercise lecturing online. So it's a bit weird. You need to adapt to the platform. And the weirdest part, I guess, is that I don't see your faces. I'm just assuming that you're there, and I'm trying to be as natural as possible. But maybe there are some things that can't be done properly in this platform. But let's try to put an optimist face to the situation and continue with our term until it comes to an end. So, what I'm going to do today is to sort of condense the contents of the lectures that were planned for Tuesday and today into one single session that is probably going to be shorter than the usual 80 minutes per session. And we're going to do the same thing next week. So Thursday, March 26th at 11, there will be another lecture with the concepts that are planned for that day. I want to encourage you to feel free to send questions at any point in time that you want. You can interrupt my explanations. That's not a problem. So here we go. It's 11 already, 11:01. So let's get started. So in this unit, we're pursuing our exploration of the main concepts that uh, have been important, that have informed research in comparative politics, and that are still quite relevant. As you might remember, the reading about the International Association of Political Science that identify several concepts that are being researched right now at the beginning of the 21st century. And the concept that we're going to explore today is governance, and another kind of related concept as well, which is federalism. So let's start with governance. Uh, as usual, we need to define what governance is all about. And at this point, I would ask you questions. I would ask people if you can um, give me a kind of a formal or intuitive definition of what governance is. But since I can't hear you, I can't see you, I'll just go ahead and present my own definition. Governance is the way power and responsibilities attached to it are distributed in a political system. This includes uh, political systems within a country or even in the international system, that is to say, around the world. Um, Governance, in other words, is framed by the institutions that exist in a given society, which can be either formal or informal. What do I mean by formal institutions? Well, those are the institutions that are there, that are the visible face of government, like legislatures, like the presidency, like uh, all the bureaucracies, all the offices, that provide services for the population. And informal, I mean the practices, or the 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 interaction that exists among citizens that is not necessarily supported by any given institution or that is mandated by any law, but that nonetheless informs or orients the way people behave in the political arena. So to be more precise, governance is the shape of a state. States are all, as we discussed a couple of weeks ago, uh, supposed to fulfill a series of obligations, a series of responsibilities. There are sovereign entities that are mandated to do that job, but they don't do that job all in the same way. There are different forms, different institutions, different practices that exist in different parts of the world that need to be understood, and there are, of course, the subject of studies in comparative politics. So, governance, the shape of a state, the specific shape that a state has taken. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that you can find institutions of governance or practices of governance in the domestic sphere within a country or in the global sphere between countries, between states. Um, and uh, there is a major difference that separates uh, what is domestic governance and international governance, and that is the issue of sovereignty. As you might remember, 2 weeks ago, we mentioned that one of the attributes, essential attributes, I should add, of the state is their ability to exercise sovereignty. That is to say, the ultimate power of the legitimate use of violence, of force within a given territory. So this is clear and obvious in most states around the world, um, but it doesn't exist in a formalized way in the international arena. So the main difference between domestic and international governance is that within the domestic um, arena, within the domestic space, there is an obvious center of power, an obvious center of sovereignty that all political actors respect and have to abide to. But in the international arena, there is no sovereign um, body that forces everyone to comply with the rules. So, in other words, the international arena depends on the goodwill of member states, on their exercise of their sovereignty to function properly. Uh, Now, the best way that we can understand how governance is organized in a given country is by looking at their constitutions. Constitution is, of course, a legal document. Is of course usually a written document, although not all of the time. But it is an explicit way in which states set up the values, the goals, the basic rules that are given to itself, and uh, they are kind of the basis, the legal foundation, or the practical foundation of the creation of the institutions, of the shape of a state, that is to say, of its governance. Beyond the legal aspect, beyond the specifically formal aspect of a given um constitution, there is a more value based uh, aspect of a constitution of any country, really, and that is that constitutions are kind of social contracts. They are understandings, basic understandings that people have to abide to and that bind a state together. Definition of your constitution is on page 174 of your textbook, and I'm going to read it now. The Constitution is the fundamental and supreme laws, usually written in a charter, that establish the basis of a political system on the basis of other laws. Further, that's on the margin of the textbook, but on the body of the text, It also says constitutions are the foundational charters and fundamental laws of most modern states. They elaborate the structure of government and express the founding principles of the regime. They are usually written documents passed by some sort of constitutional convention or constituent assembly that brings together many of a country's leading political figures to hammer out the rules, laws, and structures needed to establish the basis for political life. So, constitutions are not something that is made every day in a given state. They are, as the quote that I made, foundational documents that are produced at foundational moments of the state that are giving us, the very basis or the most important principles that a state is adopting for its function. Comparing constitutions or the formal structures of a given state is actually um, the oldest tradition in comparative politics. Even people like Aristotle or the classics, even people like Machiavelli or Tocqueville in the 18th century, they used to do that kind of thing, comparing the way institutions are created in a given country uh, and how they compare, how they are different or similar to institutions in the neighboring country. So this is not something new, comparing institutions. The purpose of this comparison is, of course, to understand what works and what doesn't. What institutions are more effective for guaranteeing certain goals, and therefore, uh, this way, comparative politics can contribute a great deal in informing, with thanks to the experience of some countries, to the adoption or rejection of some institutions in other countries. So we can safely say that comparative politics is a tool, an effective tool at that, at identifying institutions that work, institutions that are useful, institutions that are harmful, institutions that are more resilient, etc., for guaranteeing certain goals that states give to themselves. This is why the task of drafting or creating a constitution is crucial, is very important, because as I said a minute ago, it's like the foundational moment of a given state. Now, constitutions, especially we think of Canada, the United States, the countries in Western Europe, most of them have adopted constitutions a long time ago. It sounds like an exercise of the 18th, 19th century. But interestingly, many countries around the world, I might even say most countries around the world, have adopted their constitutions quite recently. The last quarter of the 20th century was a period of a very hectic, I would say, adoption of constitutions, drafting of constitutions around the world. I've met many people who have participated directly in creating the constitutions, the basis of many states around the world, uh, using their experience in comparative politics to suggest, to even sometimes participate directly in the drafting of constitution. And this is because during the last quarter of the 20th century, there were many countries that went through a process of democratization. Democratization, you might remember, is a process through which an authoritarian state, centralized state, or a military ruled country, for that matter, become more open to political competition, accept elections, create kind of a new uh, social contract for the coexistence of different points of view. And this is precisely the point of the new constitutions that want to be, tend to be, or wish to be democratic. So the end of the Cold War, the end of military governments in the Americas, um, the end of dictatorships in Africa, for instance, all of them made the need for new constitutions, the new drafting of constitutions, to be felt, and this is why um, um, the kind of the exercise of drafting constitutions has been so important. Um, There is some question from Zazu Hai. I'm not sure who that person is, but he or she asks, our current constitution was only created in the 80s. Well, not really. Not really created in the 80s. The what we call the Constitution Act 1982 was only a reform, an addition, if you will, an amendment to the already existing constitution drafted in 1867, as you know, that used to be called a British North America Act, but now it's called the Constitution Act 1867. Why I'm saying that it was only uh, a reform? Well, because the basic tenets of the Canadian state were kept intact, like the parliamentary system, like the way the parliament is formed, uh, even the exercise of this of sovereignty in uh, in the hands of the crown is still part and parcel of the Canadian Constitution. What the Constitution Act 1982 in Canada made was to add a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, was to clarify issues about the amendment of the Constitution that were kind of left in the air in 1867, and specify other issues such as transfer payments among provinces and other uh, aspects that were not very clear in the original 1867 Constitution. Ah, yes, another thing that was important in the 1982 reform that was made to the Constitution in Canada was the recognition, acceptance, admission of Indigenous rights that are from then on protected under the law. So yes, it's a recent constitution, but it's not a full constitution. It's just an amendment, an addition, if you will, to to Canada's original constitution of 1867. Okay, moving on, continuing with the lecture. The drafting of constitution, the adoption of constitution is something that we call constitutional design or constitutional engineering. Why constitutional engineering? Because drafting a constitution is very much like building uh, a huge kind of construction. Every little brick or every little piece that you add to a constitution needs to be in accordance, needs to be in harmony with other parts of the constitution. You have to sort of tap from the experience of other countries, tap from the historical experience of the country that is adopting the constitution before you decide that some things are going to be made in a certain way. Um, but uh, so this exercise of constitutional design or constitutional engineering was, as I was saying, very popular, very useful, very common in the last quarter of the 20th century. Many questions have to be answered when deciding what specific shape a constitution is going to take, what kind of institutions a country is going to adopt in order to guarantee good governance. But there are five elements that I would say are the most important for guaranteeing this effectiveness of institutions. So there are like the five questions that the newly created institutions need to be adopting in order to guarantee. Give me a second here. I need to organize my thoughts a bit. Sorry about that. I should have written this before we started the lecture, but here you are. Wanted to show you this. These are some, not all. Quite often, people who are drafting the Constitution need to um, consider many more issues here. Um, but uh, typically, these are the kind of answers that they have to provide. Whether the Constitution is going to adopt a presidential or a parliamentary system. The second item, whether the government will be elected through a plurality or proportional representation electoral system. The third is whether a constitution should be easy or hard to reform. The fourth is whether judicial review is preferable to parliamentary sovereignty. The fifth item is whether the constitution is well endowed, well equipped to guarantee democracy, the persistence of democracy in a given country. And finally, whether the state is going to be unitary or federal in nature. So those six items that I'm going to be repeating, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, are the ones that I'm going to be discussing right now. Okay, the first one. Is it better to adopt a presidential or a parliamentary system? I mean, in Canada, the question was not even asked when the first constitutional design was made in 1867. It was said, as you probably know, in the preamble of the Constitution Act 1867, that Canada will adopt from then on a constitution or similar in principle to the one existing in the United Kingdom. That is to say, parliamentary system, Westminster style, where the MPs are elected directly, and the majority, the party that gets the majority or the plurality of seats elected in the House of Commons is the one who forms the government. The leader becomes prime minister, and he acts on behalf of the sovereign, the crown, for all everyday business of government. So that question was not even asked. But for newly created states, for newly created democracies, the question is very, very clear, very, very timely. Is it better to adopt a parliamentary system similar to the one that exists in Canada, or is it better to adopt a presidential system similar to what exists, for instance, in the United States? The presidential system, you probably already know, is different in the sense that first, the chief of state and chief of government are united in one person, that is to say, the president. The president is elected through different means. Countries have different systems to elect the president, but the president is the head of the executive branch of government. There is a separately elected legislature that is a concurrent power with the president. And there is finally a judicial system that is not elected but appointed according to expertise, their understanding, knowledge, ability to enforce the laws of the land. So, whereas in the parliamentary system, the executive and the legislative are united into a single one because of the origin of the executive. The origin of the executive is the elected MPs. In the presidential system, the executive and a parliament are divided. The legislative and the executive powers are divided. Now, there is a reading that I think was assigned for today. No, it wasn't. But anyway, a Spanish political scientist, very prestigious. He passed away, but made great contributions to comparative political science. His name is Juan Linz, JuanLinz, Juan Linz. Uh, he was one of those experts that actively participated in the drafting of many a constitution around the world. And his advice on this specific respect, whether presidential or parliamentary is better, he was definitely in favor of parliamentary systems. For him, uh, parliamentary systems are superior in terms of democratic quality because they are more plural, they force a consensus, they create conditions for dialogue. In other words, they allow for more voices to be expressed in the political process, and therefore they are more conductive to negotiation, to the exercise of democracy that is a positive uh, action for newly created democracies. Presidential systems, in contrast, uh, lead to a zero sum elections because there is only one person representing one party that is going to be elected as president. The other parties are immediately excluded. And of course, the president, as I mentioned a moment ago, will be competing in terms of legitimacy, in terms of who is has more power, who is right in a specific policy issue with the legislatures. So this competition is, although it might be a good idea in more mature democracies, is not, according to Juan Lins, the best thing for a newly created um, democracies that need, to have this constant input of people um, uh, giving opinions, participating in the formulation of public policy. In other words, participating actively in the building of the new democratic state. Uh, Not everyone agrees with him. There is a debate, but I mentioned this as a valuable contribution, as probably the most authoritative voice on the issue. Um, Juan Lin's defending parliamentary system over presidential systems as the best guarantee for democracy and stability. The second issue, whether it is better for a country to adopt a plurality or proportional representation electoral system, is answered by the supplementary reading that we assigned for today, the one written by Salomon Orellana, Electoral Systems and Governance, How Diversity Can Improve Policymaking. I thought that this reading was interesting, not only because, Orellana shows uh, the clear advantages in terms of representation of political forces that proportional representation systems represent compared to plurality systems, but also because he goes a little bit further. He um, also argues that the overall performance of a given political system improves with uh, proportional representation. Why is that? Well, in systems that are decided by plurality, such as the Canadian system, where it is not necessary to win uh, even the majority of votes in a given riding in order to have an MP elected, and where the party that is going to rule over our country is not even forced to have the majority of the votes, only the plurality of the seats in the legislature. Uh, those countries are letting, or those electoral systems are letting many citizens without a voice. There is kind of a waste of voices that are expressed at the ballot that are silenced when the new government is formed. This, of course, many people argue, even political scientists would argue, gives more, uh, gives stronger, yields stronger governments because they have a clear mandate and there is no disagreement. They are more executive, if you will. They are able to make decisions more in a more authoritative way. But how about the people who have no voice? Like if you think in terms of the Canadian system, people who voted for the Green Party, for instance, the Green Party was able to make a handful of MPs elected. How about people in other parts of the country that have no voice, were whose concerns about the environment were simply ignored because of the electoral system? Let alone other people who chose uh, more popular parties, but whose candidates were not elected. For instance, here in Alberta, we saw that there is only one um, um, candidate elected from a party that is not the Conservative Party of Canada. There is only one riding in Alberta that elected an NDP um, uh, for MP, NDP candidate for MP. But I know for a fact that there are many people in many parts of the province that would have rather an NDP representative or a liberal representative or a green representative instead of just conservatives. So all these people are left voiceless. Proportional representation allows for these people to have a voice, to have a presence in parliament, and this is in and on itself more democratic in nature. On top of that, Salomon Orellana Harris, when you have more voices, when you have more diversity of parties represented um, in 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 the legislature, not only in terms of quality, but also in terms of quantity, you have a better performance of government. The government is forced for political dynamics to take into account more points of view, more opinions. Is forced to negotiate, to take more citizens' concerns into account. And even if the process may be slower, the process of adopting some measures, some decisions might be slower. In the end, the quality of the results, the quality of decisions is more comprehensive, takes into account more factors, and also, very important, more legitimate, because more people believe this is the right thing to do instead of just the people who are on the side of the party in government. Okay, moving on to the third question, or the third issue that has informed studies of uh, governance in comparative politics, is the issue of whether it is a good idea that constitutions are easy or hard to reform. There is no single model for this in, around the world. There are constitutions that are very difficult to reform, such as Canada's constitution, really, because the reform of this constitution require super majorities in both houses, the agreement of the federal units, if the country is federal, of course. Um, the typically constitutions in older democracies in North America, in Western Europe, are the toughest to reform because there are so many rules, so many strings attached to those constitutions that if you try to tweak a single aspect, a little uh, tiny part of that constitution, then other things will be compromised, and therefore it is very difficult to change them. There are other constitutions, in contrast, that are very flexible, either because the mechanisms for reform are already simple in the first place, but also because there are other sources of changing constitutions that are not necessarily like the explicit reform of the written text. So we might say, for comparative purposes, that there is a continuum. On the one hand, the tough to reform Constitution of the United States, and on the other edge, the very flexible Constitution of the United Kingdom. Why is it flexible in the United Kingdom? Well, because There is no written constitution in that country. Uh, there are a series of principles, starting with the Magna Carta to 800 years ago, and practices, decisions made by the courts that are little by little incorporated over the centuries into this kind of social contract, this basic uh, formalization of institutions of the state, but that can be amended with simple decisions made by the majority votes in parliament, and also by new policies that are adopted by the government. As long as they are not challenged by upcoming governments, they sort of incorporate into the constitution. So it is relatively easy to add, amend, or even delete some parts of the constitution in the United Kingdom. United States, in contrast, in order to change a little bit of the constitution, it requires, as I said, supermajorities, the agreement of the states. So it is extremely difficult to change. Now, what is better? A constitution that is difficult to change, a constitution that takes a very lengthy procedure to amend, or a constitution that is flexible. Flexible. Well, I would say that uh, the ability of constitutions to be changed is, in general, more positive. It is, even if some political scientists might argue that it is not conducive to stability. In general, constitutions that are flexible, that can be changed uh, easily, are superior in democratic equality. Uh, let's take a couple of examples of the cases that are more familiar to us, the cases where more that are closer to our experience. Um, uh, One of the reasons that makes it extremely difficult in the United States to change gun legislation, to put an end to these senseless, periodical shootings in schools, or this, enormous um, amount of guns that are in the streets, in the homes of citizens in the United States. You you know that is the Second Amendment. It's a formal amendment to the U.S. Constitution that basically guarantee that every person in the United States has the constitutional right to own uh, a gun, some kind of a weapon. This amendment was adopted a long time ago in the late 18th century, when guns were necessary perhaps to defend the country, when guns were not semi-automatic rifles. They were very simple tools for hunting or self-defense. But nonetheless, because this became a formal amendment of the Constitution, it hasn't been changed ever since, and therefore it has become the basis for very liberal, very open legislation, allowing for the use and abuse, I might say, of the ownership of guns in that country. Another example of how bad rigidity of a constitution can be, we can be found here in Canada, right? The Senate provides for a very uneven representation of the provinces within Ottawa. And we as Albertans know that because we have the same amount of representatives as other lesser provinces, such as Newfoundland. I don't want to insult anyone who comes from that province, of course, but considering the population, the economic importance of our province, only having six senators is kind of an insult, especially considering that both Ontario and Quebec have 24 senators each. So the issue of the uneven representation of the provinces within the Senate has been raised over and over and over, um, and many attempts at reforming this unbalance have been made. But guess what? Because the Constitution of Canada, the original Constitution, 1867, is so difficult to reform, even when the new procedure for reforming was adopted in 1982, uh, then there is nothing that can be done, or nothing that has been done related to the Senate. Okay, Ryan. Okay, now I know what that is. Hello, Ryan. Asked two questions. Would changing the Second Amendment actually change much in terms of gun violence in the United States? Many of the laws in states such as California could be seen as violations of the Second Amendment already, but violence in this states is quite persistent. Well, of course, I can't tell that for sure. I can say if changing the Second Amendment would be enough to change gun legislation in the United States and put an end to violence. But I can tell you for sure that reference to this Second Amendment is the main or the major tool in the hands of the NRA, National Rifle Association, the most important pro-gun lobby in the United States, to block, to oppose to any changes in the legislation, any changes, of course, that might restrict the ownership and on the unuse of guns. Uh, and it is seen like a sacrosanct right of every citizens of the United States that gets in the way of any meaningful reform of uh, of that of that legislation. Uh, so attempts at changing this constitutional amendment are difficult, if not impossible. Even people like former President Obama, that were very much against, the use of guns, the indiscriminate sale of guns, uh, couldn't do much in terms of restricting them more because of this constitutional obstacle. Um, there are, of course, practices that states make that are arguably not in agreement with the Second Amendment, but even then, the persistence of gun ownership in other states is a problem for the United States. Hopefully, I answered the question. Of course, those who defend constitutions that are hard to reform, they talk about stability, predictability. If you know that a constitution is not going to be changed in the foreseeable future, you can count on the system. You can count that the system is not going to change, and you can count on the paucity of a constitution. Constitutions that are hard to amend are usually shorter, not so complex, not so detailed, because the, the laws will spell out the details related to uh, the exercise of constitutional rights in a more detailed way. In contrast, constitutions that are easy to amend are complex, long, difficult, more challenging to lawyers for sure. Uh, there are some constitutions that even incorporate social rights, not just political and civil rights, but also social rights. That is to say that uh, step into the area of social justice or economic justice. Examples of this are the constitutions of Brazil, adopted in 1988, the Constitution of Mexico, that even it was adopted in 1917, has been amended many times, and incorporates rights like right to education, right to housing, right to kind of collective agreements, workers in the workplace, and that type of thing. The Constitution of Germany, that provides for comparable living standards in the different regions of the country. Constitution that was adopted 1947, right after the Second World War. The Constitution of South Africa as well, that provides for many socioeconomic rights for the population. Uh, these constitutions are very expansive, if you will. They're easy to amend, relatively easy to amend, and critics of these constitutions believe that they are the basis for entitlement, for the perceived right of many population, specific sectors of the population, to ask more and more from the government in terms of services, in terms of allocation of resources, in terms of, uh, of expansive rights altogether. Canada is in between. It's a country that is rigid in some aspects, like the Senate, as I mentioned, but that is also open to reform of some constitutional aspects because of the British heritage that we have in our constitutional tradition here. So some things can be changed quite simply um, with simple policies adopted in the House of Commons or the Senate. But there are other things, like kind of the bedrock things, that are very hard to change, such as the Senate, such as the electoral system, and other older principles of the Canadian system. The other aspect, the following aspect, is whether we're now to number four, is whether it is better for our constitution to have a judicial review or parliamentary sovereignty system. This is understood by comparing once again, the system in Canada and the system in the United States. Judicial review is the ability of the courts to strike down decisions that have been made by the legislatures. Uh, and parliamentary sovereignty is the opposite, that parliaments, legislatures, elected representatives are supreme or are above the decisions made by the courts. The courts are, in fact, only charged, at least formally so, of implementing or putting into practice decisions that have been made by elected representatives. So, what is at stake here in this decision that constitutional engineers need to make is who has the last word in regards to the law, the courts or the legislature? Again, there is no clear answer. There is no universal answer that applies to every single case in the world. Um, Usually, in presidential systems, it is the courts that have this ultimate authority. Judicial review prevails. In parliamentary systems, legislatures have the last word. Um, some parliamentary system um, don't even allow the legislatures to uh, the courts to interpret the law. In case of doubt, uh, the, the justices have to go back to to the legislature in order to ask to clarify the meaning of a given law. Um, and there are also some systems that are kind of mixed, that have incorporated aspects of both systems. And the best case in point here is Canada. Canada has, in some respects, parliamentary supremacy, parliamentary sovereignty for most of the things that are decided by the government, decided by the House of Commons. But um, uh, ever since the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was introduced in the 1982 reform, now there is room for some type of judicial review when the court orders Parliament or the provinces to change legislation that is supposed to um, infringe upon rights that are protected by the Constitution. So it is a system that is mixed, that was uh, kind of a change, that changed the equation of the UK system in 1982, and is now uh, kind of informed by the two systems at the same time. Uh, this raises the issue of judicial activism. Judicial, judicial activism, that is to say, the ability of judges to creatively interpret the law and change in a way the sense of a given legislation. Is that something that should be encouraged or not in a constitutional system? Well, this is again not a universal recipe. This is something that changes from country to another. And uh, we might say that it is kind of as in many other aspects of constitutional engineering, a two-edged sword. Sometimes it can be used for good, sometimes it can be used for bad. When the judges kind of take the liberties of interpreting the law, and in their implementation, even changing the deep sense of that law. The fifth acted aspect, I mean, that constitutional engineers usually face is whether they are able or not to guarantee that the Constitution will protect a democratic state. This is a very old question. This is a question that motivated the practice of comparative politics from the very start of the discipline as such, in the late 19th century. To what extent some institutions are better fit for preserving democracy, preserving democratic practice than others. And it is uh, a question that really matters to answer, because uh, with the actual practice, or the formal institutions that are put in place, the Constitution is supposed to set out universal laws and constrain the powers of a single ruler. This is kind of the main purpose of democratic systems, or constitutions that want to promote a democratic system, constrain the power of the rulers, and set out universal laws that will apply to every single citizen of a given country. Nowadays, most countries around the world, most members of the United Nations, have constitutions that, uh, in principle or formally, protect democracy, that are uh, constraining the power of rulers, that are providing universal laws to people. But the issue is, or the most important thing from the perspective of comparative politics, is to look not only at the formal design of the constitutions, but to the actual practice of those constitutions. Because sometimes, and quite often, I should say, the letter of the constitution does not live up to the actual practice of the way the constitution is applied on the ground. Let me just give you an example, and that example is Nigeria, the African country in Western Africa. Nigeria, if you look at the constitution, if you read the constitution of that country, it is a federal country. That is to say, there is a division of powers between the central government and the constituent units that are autonomous, that have their own government, etc. However, in actual practice, Nigeria is a very centralized country, uh, with the succession of military governments, and especially fueled by um, the greed or the ambition of the control of the plentiful energy resources that were found in that country. The power of the states has been constrained a great deal. So now this power is more formal than real. The central government is overwhelmingly powerful and has every right, either legally or de facto right, to uh, force the states to comply with decisions that are made at the center. So if we look at the Nigerian constitution, we say, well, this is a federal country. There is division of jurisdictions, and everything is so clear. But when we look at the actual practice, we see that this is not so. Uh, Therefore, it is crucially necessary to not only look at the text, but also look at the practice when it comes to evaluating whether a given constitution uh, actually guarantees the exercise of democracy in a given country. Um, some constitutions explicitly exclude or at least limit the privilege of some social groups, uh, like churches, like the military, some ethnic groups. Uh, these groups can be singled out either for protection or for exclusion of political power. And this is another aspect of protecting democracy that needs to be considered in a given when studying a given constitution. And finally, we're going to go to the sixth element that constitutional engineers need to answer. Is it better to create a federal or a unitary system in a given country? And for this, we're going to use the reading that was assigned for today, written by Ronald Watts, Comparing Federal Systems. Um, Ronald Watts was one of the most authoritative scholars in the study of federalism in this country. He was one of the founders of the Institute for International Intergovernmental Relations at Queen's University, Kingston, Ontario. And he wrote this book in the late 1990s, but it is very valid because of the amount of uh, theory, amount of comparative studies that is made in that in that in that text. So first of all, it is necessary to understand what is federalism. And here I'm going to open my reading. Where's that? Here. The reading is available in e-class. Okay, I need to go to the dashboard. To 35. Here. If you go to the Watts reading, please look for page number 6, I believe. Yes, page 6. On page 6, you have a definition of the terms and principles of federalism. Ronald Watts writes the following: Federalism is basically not a descriptive but a normative term and refers to the advocacy of multi tiered government combining elements of shared rule and regional self rule. It is based on the presumed value and validity of combining unity and diversity and of accommodating, preserving, and promoting distinct identities within a larger political union. The essence of federalism as a normative principle is the perpetuation of both union and non centralization at the same time. This is, well, and I've taught courses on comparative federalism several times. This definition that Ronald Watts is providing at the end of page 6 in your reading is perhaps the most comprehensive, the most useful that I've ever found. So let's go step by step through it. Federalism is basically not a descriptive but a normative term. You already know by now. We talked about that in when we were discussing democracy, when we were discussing development, what being normative means. It means that it is a goal, it is an ideal, but that you will not necessarily find it perfectly expressed in actual institutions. Refers to the advocacy of multi-tier government, that is to say, governments that have several layers, combining elements of shared rule and regional self-rule. So in that multi-tier, you see that there are some things that apply to everyone in a given state, and that are others that apply to some regions only. Federalism, what goes on, is based on the presumed value and validity of combining unity and diversity and accommodating, preserving, and promoting distinct identities within a larger political unit. It combines unity and diversity. This is a very important uh, of value of federalism, the ability of putting together or making it possible both unity and diversity. So unity of purpose, cooperation of all regions, and diversity, respect for regional differences, for regional choices, regional ways of doing things, and it promotes distinct identities. It allows for the expression of different ways of doing things. So the essence of federalism, what concludes, is a normative principle, is the perpetuation of both union and non-centralization at the same time. So there you go. This is a very useful definition that I would encourage you to uh, study and understand every single aspect of it, because it encompasses all types of federal experiences around the world. Now, how popular is federalism in the world? Look at page 182 in your textbook, and you will find a map. 182. Yeah, a map that looks like this. It is showing in kind of that pale yellow color, cream color, the countries in the world that are federal, and the rest, the green color, are the countries that are not federal at all. So as you can see, most countries are not federal, but the ones that are federal have something in common. If you were here in front of me, I would um, wait for you to tell me what these countries have in common. But because you're not here, I'm going to tell you right away. The largest countries in the world are federal. We're talking about Russia, we're talking about Canada, we're talking about Brazil, United States, Australia, Argentina, India. Uh, so those are big, massive countries, the largest in the world, I should say. Um, but there is one exception. And that exception to that general rule is China. China is not keen of federalism, is not keen on adopting that type of uh, self-governing principle because of their very narrow, or I should even say, authoritarian definition of what state sovereignty is all about. So you have another element there to understand uh, the value of federalism. Countries that want to be democratic, that are large, where the central government is unable to really cater to the needs of every single region in the country, chances are that they will become federal and adopt that system of government when it comes to making definition, when it comes to deciding what to do, how to implement the distribution of power in a given country. Now, there are two basic types of federalism that are practiced around the world, and those types are called territorial and multinational. The territorial principle is very easy to understand. There is a division of the territory of a given state in different states, federal units. They are called differently depending on the country we're talking about. Here in Canada, of course, they are called provinces. In Germany, they are called Länder. In Belgium, they are called forgot. Uh, well, in Switzerland, they are called cantons. In Spain, they're called autonomous communities, and so on and so forth. The name is not important. What matters though is that in territorial federal systems, all of the units that are part of the unit have exactly the same definition, the same rights, the same scope, the same relation to the federal government, and there is no kind of uh, difference other than the region in the way these uh, federal units are organized. That is the territorial version of federalism. There is another type of federalism that is called the multinational federalism. We've discussed when we were talking about nationalism and nations that there are some states that contain within their borders uh, some peoples, minority groups that are distinct, that are very different from the majority of the population, that call themselves nations because they have a different culture, different language, different history. And typically, countries that uh, have these type of national minorities within their borders also face demands of these national minorities to be treated differently. To be those national minorities want to self-govern, to have the tools for protecting their territory, to preserve their history, their language, um, and therefore these countries are very often forced to adopt a multi-tiered uh, system, or a system that guarantees some special rights to those units that are culturally distinct, that are culturally different. For instance, in Spain, the autonomous communities that I was telling you about are not all the same. There are some regions, such as Catalonia, such as the Basque Country, such as Galicia, that have a different organization in their government, that have different powers compared to other regions of Spain, and that have adopted different languages as their official languages. And therefore, Spain is a case of multinational multinational federation. The same can be said of Russia. Russia has a very different definitions of the units. Not all the states in the Russian Federation have the same rights. There are some states, typically those that are where the majority of the population are indigenous peoples, that have different systems of governing, different official languages, different practices of government. This doesn't mean that these parts are not part of either Spain or Russia, right? They are still part of the country, and they don't want necessarily to separate from the main country. But what it means is that the constitutions have recognized for them special rights, special ways of implementing their power, and uh, and therefore they can't be understood with the same logic as territorial federalism, with everyone is exactly the same. Another case of a multinational federalism that is closer to home is Canada, of course. In Canada, we have a province that, no matter what, whether we like it or not, has different rights, has different traditions, different official language, and that province is, of course, Quebec. The difference of Quebec within the Canadian Federation is protected by the Constitution, is protected by convention, and even though, very kind of controversial expressions such as calling Quebec a distinct society have never been formalized in the Constitution. Nonetheless, Quebec has a different type of government that is not exactly the same as elsewhere in Canada. Different pension system, different official language, um, and even the fact that they believe of themselves as being a nation is reflected in the name of their legislature is called the National Assembly rather than the Legislative Assembly or provincial parliament as in Ontario. Um, Alfred Stepan, Stepan, Stepan. Oh, okay. So before I move on, there is another question from Ryan. Does the nation status of Indigenous peoples in Canada also contribute to Canada being a multinational model of federalism? Yes, it does. Thanks for the question, Ryan. Because also, uh, through the treaty rights that most Indigenous peoples in this country have acquired even before the creation of the Canadian state or in the process of the creation of the Canadian states, have given them special rights or the ability to self-government, rights over the territory, etc., that also add to the multinational nature of federalism in this country. Yes, thanks for the question, for the clarification. That is another element that adds to the multinational nature of federalism in Canada. Okay, moving on. I was mentioning Alfred Stepan, Stepan, his last name, uh, was also one of the uh, prestigious comparative political scientists that contributed to drafting constitutions all over the world, that he was consulted because of his experience in studying comparatively many countries. He started doing Brazilian politics, but then his scope of interest and expertise expanded to the rest of the world. He wrote a very influential article where he um, calls for newly established democracies of rejecting or at least not adopting uh, exactly the same type of federalism that exists in the United States. In other words, he was warning against the adoption of territorial federalism everywhere because he basically argues some countries need multinational federalism, need asymmetrical arrangements of federalism in order to preserve peace, in order to preserve harmony, the national minorities that exist within their borders. So this is something that uh, is, and I have the article around here. If you wait for a sec. Democracy was originally published in a book edited by Larry Diamond, The Global Divergence of Democracies, published back in 2001. And if anyone is interested, I could post it in on eClass, of course. But there is an abstract of that article also contained in your textbook. Uh, it's in the box of page 186. Federalism and Democracy being the U.S. model. Uh, Although there is a little change that needs to be made to the abstract that is provided there. So the abstract says, Stepan notes that some instances of federalism are asymmetrical, with greater power given to some subnational regions than others. In addition to the three multinational countries mentioned previously, Canada also fits this model. Its French speaking province of Quebec has been recognized as a distinct society from the other provinces. So, in the last phrase in that paragraph, uh, the authors of our textbook write, in some, Stepan notes the diversity of federal arrangements and argues that all federalism does not follow the US model. Well, actually, Stepan is even more direct than that. Stepan says that all federalism should not follow the US model. They say that this model, when it is applied uh, automatically in newly created democracies that have uh, minority nations or national minorities within their borders, it can be very, very bad because it oppresses and leads to disagreement, leads to conflict, and in the end, it may lead to challenging democracy. Okay, so this is what I had to say. As I said, it is kind of a condensed version of what I was planning to do in class uh, in front of you. We are almost at the 1 hour and 20 minutes mark. Um, I wonder if you have any questions, any comments at this point that you want to make. Otherwise, you know that I'm available uh, by email, and you can contact me anytime or contact Esan for other issues or related issues. Um, so while you think about it, let me repeat what I said. We will have a session, a similar lecture, live lecture on Thursday, March 26th at the same time at 11 a.m. So I will try to condense the readings and discussion that were planned for next week, dealing with the concept of ideologies. And again, I would encourage you to make the readings as usual, and prepare your questions, your comments before we meet. Also, have a look at this website that is indicated in the syllabus, the World Values Survey, because it is another tool of those that didn't exist back in the day when I started doing this, that are now at your disposal for free for the type of research in comparative policy that we can make. Okay, Justina has a question. Are you going to post questions for a second assignment on e-class? Of course, that was my commitment. As soon as I end this stream, I will post them. And you have 1 week from today, so that is March 26th, to send them to Esan and myself through email. We have no choice. I originally said that we wouldn't accept uh, electronic submissions, but what do you know? Now we have to. So email your answers, and if you have any questions about the instructions, about the specifics of uh, on the assignment, let me know. Yes, Danielle, it is due at 11 a.m. and I'm hoping that you will send it either then or earlier. The assignment is very easy. I think it's very simple, especially that now that you are home and you have all your materials handy, and therefore um, I think you will be able to send it even before Thursday. Any other questions? Any other comments? Okay, I'm going to stay live while I post the assignment. See if you want to react or say something. Oh, come on. Copy link. Okay, let's see if I can do it this way. So I'm going to add the assignment. As a link in the governance and federalism part. In e-class, assign. Okay, it's there. Okay, it is a Word Online attachment. So could anyone try and open the attachment right now? See if it is accessible to all of you. I'm waiting for anyone to tell me if it's working well. Maybe Danielle, or it works. Justina says it works. Do you have any questions, Justina? Or Ryan, or Danielle? Or Sasu Zai? Who's Sasu Zai? Is he or she still there? Well, Danielle and Justina say it works, so I will trust that everyone will have access to it. And let me know if you have any questions. Thank you, Justina, for sticking out, and I'll see you, I guess, 1 week from now. Okay, I'm going to close the session, but you can go back to it whenever you want. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Take care. Stay safe. Bye.